There we are. So I'll say again, my name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member in the School of Urban Studies and Planning. And welcome to our first official week, non-canceled week, of the Transportation Seminar that I co-organized with Rob Bertini from Civil Engineering, who's unable to be here this week. One logistics thing I want to remind everyone, if you're going to ask a question, there are microphones scattered throughout. Hopefully there's one in front of you. When you ask a question, please use the microphone and hold down on the touch button while you're speaking until the red light will be on. And then when you're done, you can take your finger off. That is so the people out watching us on the web, either live or archived later, can hear the question in addition to the answer. So please remember to do that. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers, which is half me. But first is going to be Cy Adler, and then I'm going to follow up. And we're going to be talking about some work that Cy has been working on for quite some time, and I joined him on this in the past year, looking at Oregon's transportation planning rule, sort of how did we get to where we are, the evolution of the rule, and then what's going on. So we're trying to answer that question, is there any impact? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Cy. I'm going to sit up. Do you want to sit or stand?
I'll stand.
Okay.
Good afternoon. As Jennifer said, I've been interested in the transportation planning rule for a long time. This is actually my fourth cut at it. And I see Scott Siegel in the audience, and I'd like to acknowledge the very critical role that Scott played in collecting information for me to utilize at the very beginning. The first cut involved a look at where the rule came from. And then since that time, I've come back to it 3 additional times to look at the way the rule has evolved. And then, as Jennifer said, most recently, to look at the most recent evolution of the rule and then look at its impact on the ground. The rule was especially interesting to me because it was one of a set of policy innovations, pretty ambitious policy innovations adopted in Oregon about the same period of time. Along with the transportation planning rule, Oregon went into the Oregon Health Plan, which was a major innovation in that field. There was the educational reform effort that was launched about the same time. And there was also a pretty dramatic innovation in welfare reform. So it was a period when the legislature and then appointed bodies like the Land Conservation and Development Commission were striking out in some pretty interesting and radical directions. So I was interested in what it was like to adopt such a rule, and then, of course, subsequently how it evolved over time. In addition, the rule was an opportunity to examine some fundamental questions in planning theory, especially the intergovernmental context within which planning takes place. Here in Oregon, a state-level agency in some relation to the legislature, the very intense involvement of state organizations like the Department of Land Conservation Development, the Oregon Department of Transportation, and the relationship between those state-level agencies and local and regional level counterparts like Metro, the City of Portland, other local government jurisdictions, and then relations between those government agencies and private sector organizations. And of course, whenever we're talking about the planning program here in the state of Oregon, Thousand Friends of Oregon plays a very central role, but also industry-related groups. A fascinating aspect of this entire process is the ways in which planners, public sector, private sector planners, and industry people function as a community as these things are adopted and evolve over time. It's a fairly small place, of course, and there have been a lot of people involved, both public and private, who have been active on these issues for a very long time. They all know each other. It's one of the fascinating aspects of it, that most people involved in the way the rule has changed over time on a first-name basis and have shifted positions, shifted sectors over time, and have sustained an interest in these issues over a very long period. So it was fascinating for me to look at the way the community of planners and those who were involved with planning collectively shape the way this thing has changed since it was adopted in 1991. So it begins largely as an effort to deal with a proposed freeway that was going to cross over the urban growth boundary on the western end of the region. The Western Bypass, a project favored by Washington County and Metro at the time, gives rise to a rulemaking effort. But during the initial period, rulemaking goes in a different direction and becomes much broader and addresses the entire topic of the relationship between transportation and land use planning, and sets an agenda for the way integrated land use and transportation planning ought to take place at the local level, at the regional level, during the coming period. And in that process of rulemaking, it seemed to me clear that Thousand Friends played a leading role in, as a lot of the public sector planners said, pushing the envelope, pushing the rule in a particular direction so as to address Goal 12, the key aspect of Goal 12, which is to reduce principal reliance on any one mode of transportation, to reduce principal reliance on the automobile. So the point was, as the rule evolved, to do land use planning to create a supportive context for alternatives to the automobile. And during the rulemaking process, a very detailed mandate evolved in which state-level agencies, Department of Land Conservation and Development and Oregon Department of Transportation, articulated some very stringent mandates for local and regional governments to adopt. So again, what I'll do is talk a little bit about how the rule has evolved over time, and then what Jennifer is going to do is present a lot of information on travel trends that give us some sense of the impact of the rule on travel behavior. The rule required many things. Do you have that? Here are the biggies. Reduce VMT per capita in regions, 10% in 20 years, 30%, 20% in 30 years. And then along with it, reduce parking spaces per capita by 10% in 20 years. What was so dramatic about that is that, of course, the trends were all in the opposite direction. VMT had been growing dramatically, far faster than population. And so here the rule sets out a requirement to turn that around, which would involve some pretty dramatic changes in travel behavior and in investments and, of course, in the pattern of land development that was taking place in the region. And then the accompanying notion to reduce parking spaces per capita, again, flied in the face of land development trends of a very long-standing nature. It was a very controversial set of requirements, as you can imagine. A lot of people, perhaps most people, didn't think it was feasible to achieve these objectives. There was a lot of interest, though, on the part of members of the Land Conservation and Development Commission, as well as Thousand Friends, to incorporate explicit targets in the rule, and also to require that government agencies adopt benchmarks, interim benchmarks, that would enable state-level actors to ascertain progress toward achieving the objective. There was also a great deal of skepticism on the part of local and regional planners about utilizing VMT as the specific measure for the reduction of principal reliance on the automobile. Local and regional level folks had a great deal of trouble with the notion that they can measure VMT and VMT per capita. However, after a lot of back and forth between members of the community, it was agreed that VMT was an available measure that was as good as others people could put forward, and that it was important to include a specific target. So this is the way the rule initially came down. In addition to what's here, local governments were given a pretty tight schedule to adopt land use and design regulations within 2 years of adoption of the rule that would facilitate transit-oriented development, in general to set a land development context to support alternatives to the automobile. And then, as you see here, within 4 years, local and regional governments were supposed to adopt transport system plans that would achieve the VMT reduction target. That's the way the rule went forward. Fairly quickly, though, it became evident that it was going to take a lot longer than 2 years for local governments to adopt that initial set of land use and design regulations to shape the development pattern differently, and that it was going to take longer than 4 years for transport system plans to emerge. So immediately, fairly quickly after rule adoption, movements start to take place aiming at amending the rule, at loosening some of the mandates that had been adopted in 1991. And there was an interesting pattern. Two of the main issues that emerged early on that would have to be incorporated in the land use and design guideline changes had to do with building orientation and connectivity. The building orientation issue became a real problem for commercial developers, especially large-scale retailers and people involved in auto-oriented businesses like service stations. Folks involved in commercial development were very troubled by efforts to do land use and design guidelines that would require them to orient their buildings to the street and to transit stops. Residential developers were very worried by street connectivity requirements. And so, as local governments struggled to write this first set of ordinances, a tremendous amount of conflict emerged at the local level. For example, here in Portland, where City of Portland planners were among the staunchest supporters of the rule, a major conflict developed between the retail task force and representatives of the commercial development industry and local government planners on the issue of building orientation. And it took a very long time for anything to emerge out of the interaction between the industry group and the planners. In other parts of the region, other kinds, related kinds of issues developed. In Washington County, for example, serious conflict developed between industrial park, campus-type development folks and planners who wanted to, again, do building orientation rules which would change the way the folks who developed campus-type developments behaved. And in other parts of the region, similar sorts of conflicts emerged. One major exception to this pattern was in the city of Gresham, where the mayor of Gresham, Gussie McRoberts, at the time, was as strong a supporter of rule requirements as anybody in the state. And the planning department there adopted a fairly dramatic set of both building orientation and street connectivity regulations. So Gresham now posed a specter to those in the commercial and residential development industries of how far a local government could go to change the rules. And this reinforced the concern on the part of those in the development industry to get some changes made to the rule at the state level. So in light of the conflicts that were emerging at the street level in getting out this first set of rule changes, the state agency, Land Conservation and Development Commission, began to talk about a process of amending the rule to loosen it up with regard to what would be possible. Yeah?
What issue with street connectivity to the residents did trouble the residents?
Not residents, residential developers.
What was the issue with it that troubled them?
There were a couple of issues that troubled them. First, they thought it would lead to more streets, and that would be more expensive for them to construct. And in some cases, they worried that accessibility, increased accessibility, would be a worry for potential home buyers. If, for example, you had an apartment building fairly close to where you were doing a single-family residential development and you had to meet these connectivity requirements, the developers worried that potential home buyers would be concerned about how accessible their project was to those living in apartment buildings nearby. So LCDC began to undertake a process of revising the rule to address some of these concerns. And again, it relates to a fascinating issue in planning theory about the extent to which higher level governments impose mandates on lower level governments. And of course, it brings in the issue again of Thousand Friends, which generally supported the most stringent mandates possible for local government planners. From the point of view of activist organizations, not just Thousand Friends, but others interested in this issue, Bicycle Transportation Alliance, Willamette Pedestrian Coalition, activist organizations tend to want as detailed, specific rules and regulations articulated at the higher level in order to minimize the discretion available to local level planners. I mean, briefly, their view of the world is local government planners are subject to intense pressures from developers and locally elected officials to be responsive to industry concerns. And so the protection against that is to reduce the amount of discretion that local government planners have to respond to these pressures. And the way you do that is by writing the rules and regulations that come down from a higher level in a very detailed, very specific way. So local government planners, again, facing this pressure from developers and local officials at their level, were saying to the state, you got to loosen up here. You got to give us some room to maneuver. You got to let us be responsive to particular issues in our jurisdictions. And of course, that was taken as a threat by Thousand Friends and other activists who worried the looser things get, the more these sorts of requirements are going to recede into the far distant future. So a compromise was worked out during this initial phase of amendment that led to dates slipping. What was required in 2 years would now be required in 3 years. What was required in 4 years would now be required in 5 or 6. So deadlines began to slip and mandates began to loosen. But again, it was all part of a communal discussion about what was possible and also what was desirable. And at this point in time, most people were still thinking, yeah, this is going to be tough. It's probably not possible, but it's the right thing to do. We really should be doing land use development to support alternative modes of transport. That's the right thing to do. It's hard, but again, it ought to be our goal. Now, because the VMT reduction mandate was so demanding, and again, there was so much skepticism on the part of everybody involved with regard to feasibility of achieving it, the rule built in a 5-year review of the VMT target. And so around 1996, LCDC launched an effort to revisit this aspect of the rule. And the state agency hired a consultant firm, Parsons Brinkerhoff, to oversee the process of revisiting the VMT reduction mandate. The consultant firm conducted interviews with participants from all the sectors: state government people, local government, regional government people, industry people, advocates, to develop a comprehensive assessment of where we stand with regard to rule implementation and what appear to be candidates for change. It's in the context of this rule review that planners here at Metro, planners throughout the state, articulate clearly a sense that based on the analytical work that they've been able to do thus far, there's no way this VMT reduction target can be achieved at any point, absent the use of fairly draconian congestion pricing. And outside the Portland metropolitan area, there isn't anyone in the state of Oregon who thinks congestion pricing has any chance of political feasibility. So that's one issue, that more and more planners are concluding there's no way we can achieve this target absent this very unpopular policy tool. Something's got to give. And in some cases in the state, this seemed to me a fairly dramatic development. I wasn't aware of similar sorts of things happening in other parts of the planning program. Local and regional planners simply refuse to conform to state-level mandates. For example, regional plans were supposed to incorporate interim benchmarks toward achieving the 20-year and the 30-year objective. In some cases in the state, planners submitted plans to the state agency that did not have them and said to the state, we're not going to do this because it simply doesn't make sense. So, to an extent, a rebellion was brewing within the community of planners about implementing this rule. At the same time, segments of industry were themselves in open rebellion, especially about the parking reduction mandate. Industry groups were telling whomever would listen that reducing parking spaces is simply crazy. It doesn't make any sense. It would devastate the competitive position of merchants who gave up parking spaces. And so something would have to give there as well. So this sort of groundswell of opposition was building both among planners as well as industry groups. The advocates are trying to hold the line, and that's the sort of political mix within which the consultant firm makes a set of recommendations for amendments to the rule. Parsons-Brinkerhoff recommends staying with the VMT reduction notion of utilizing VMT as a target, although it recommends reducing the target from 10 to 5%. But in an assessment of other possible targets at which to aim, Parsons-Brinkerhoff concludes this is still as good as any they can think of. And it ought to remain the standard, a position that Thousand Friends and the other advocates supported. Parsons-Brinkerhoff was willing to say, let's stick with this, albeit at a lower level, because of a very important piece of analytical work it had done in conjunction with Thousand Friends of Oregon, which was the Lutrax study. This was a major departure for Thousand Friends when it began around the time the rule was adopted. Foregoing its traditional role as a watchdog, as an agency that monitors and then sues when a government agency does something that it thinks violates the law, Thousand Friends decided to take a more proactive approach, to actually demonstrate that if land development patterns change, it will be possible to achieve these transport objectives. And so it got a grant from the federal government to undertake a massive study to demonstrate, again, the viability of changing land use plans as a way of achieving transport objectives, and worked with Parsons-Brinkerhoff on that study. So having done that analytical work, Parsons-Brinkerhoff was persuaded that yes, alternative modes of transport can be enhanced, VMT can be reduced if appropriate land use changes are made, but it'll take a longer time and the target ought to be changed in order to make that happen. So the Lutrax study, again, a major innovation by Thousand Friends, played a critical role in the willingness of Parsons-Brinkerhoff to continue to support the notion that VMT is an appropriate thing VMT reduction is an appropriate thing to aim at, and it's possible to achieve some real gains in that area. In addition, Parsons-Brinkerhoff looked at the way Metro allocated its resources in the recent period and saw that Metro, in fact, had already been making changes in the way it allocated flexible funds under its control so as to enhance alternative modes of transport. So given that regional governmental commitment to supporting alternative modes, and given the possibilities associated with changing land use plans, changing land development patterns to support alternative modes, Parsons-Brinkerhoff said, let's stick with this, again, albeit let's expect a little less of what we can accomplish, especially in this time frame. Other planners said there's something inherently flawed with the VMT reduction goal, and made an interesting philosophical argument about the relationship between a reduction in VMT and the notion about reliance, a reduction in reliance. a number of planners argued that there isn't really a close relationship between reduction in vehicle miles traveled and reduction in automobile reliance. That the notion of reducing reliance is captured more effectively by a notion of increasing the modal share of other forms. Now again, this is not what Parsons-Brinkerhoff came down in support of, but more and more people are saying that if we really want to reduce reliance, we ought to think about that less as people traveling fewer miles in cars and more people taking advantage of other modal possibilities, increasing modal share of alternative modes of transport. This all is managed and digested by the community of planners, and again, it's so fascinating to watch the community attempt to arrive at some common ground on these very controversial issues. And what LCDC does is loosen yet further by offering an opportunity for regional governments to propose an alternate standard to the VMT reduction. LCDC invites regional governments to say, all right, we have another way of approaching this, and here's why we think our approach makes as much sense and has as much chance to achieve the objectives. In addition, LCDC offers a possibility with regard to achieving the parking reduction goal. Instead of cutting spaces as proposed in the original measure, LCDC says, again, suggest another alternative that involves managing the supply and the price of parking differently so as to achieve the objective. So again, the sense is pressures are building up at the local level. Planners are worried about the possibilities of achieving these objectives. They need some room to maneuver. And LCDC recognizes that some room to maneuver has to be put in place. In addition, Parsons-Brinkerhoff recommends that a major study of the feasibility of congestion pricing be undertaken. And in fact, Metro, in cooperation with a lot of other agencies, begins a major congestion pricing study shortly afterwards. So the next step to set the stage for what Jennifer is going to talk about is Metro's response to all of these sorts of things. Metro's adoption of 2040 is a major event because the 2040 plan embodies pretty clearly most of the things that the rule contemplated when it said do an integrated land use transportation plan that would achieve reduced reliance on the automobile. State-level people in land use thought that Metro's 2040 was a great piece of work, as did Thousand Friends. It was the only regional government in the state that was willing to say publicly, we want to achieve the mandates that are set out in the rule and to adopt a plan that would move the region in that direction. Although Metro planners also said they need some room to maneuver with regard to the specific requirements that were in the rule, and Metro planners supported the notion of alternative ways of achieving these objectives. So the 2040 plan was a major step in the direction of implementing rule mandates. And then some fascinating back and forth between Metro and the state land use agency with regard to the specific proposals that Metro was making to achieve rural objectives. And here again, in the back and forth between Metro, local governments within the region, and the state, this classic issue of the amount of discretion available to local level planners again emerged front and center. What the state level people worried about was the extent to which Metro would be able to monitor and enforce rule-related requirements on local governments within the alternative approach. Because the alternative approach that Metro articulated did involve increasing modal shares of non-automotive modes and street connectivity related issues. So Metro proposed to implement these aspects of the 2040 plan through its designation of different land use types, regional centers, station communities. Those became the vehicles for organizing responses to rule mandates. So, for example, different levels of modal shares for alternative modes within different land use types, different street connectivity requirements within different land use types. The state agency worried about Metro's capacity to enforce and then monitor compliance with those rules. And so there was some interesting back and forth between the state and Metro before an agreement was reached about exactly how Metro was going to behave, again, to monitor and enforce those requirements for modal shares and for pedestrian orientation as measured through street connectivity. But the state was willing, it seems to me, to work with Metro on this alternative approach because it was absolutely critical for the state to be able to say that it's possible, it's feasible to implement, if not the exact requirements that were articulated back in 1991, then some amended version of what was put out back then, that somebody is willing and able to do this. And if Metro said it needed the following flexibility to achieve the objective, then it seems to me it was critical for the state to say, okay, we're willing to work with you on this to enable you to achieve the outcome. Because no one else in the state was stepping up as Metro was to try to achieve these objectives. Yeah.
So,
Could you use the microphone?
Push the button on the
so
microphone.
what about Gresham then?
Well, Gresham adopted its ordinance. So Gresham was way out in front and behaved very dramatically compared to what other local governments were willing to do. And then it became a matter of integrating Gresham's approach into a larger regional strategy. And that was Metro's job. Okay, Jennifer is going to talk now about some of the travel trends, travel behavior changes we've seen during this period.
Okay. Forgot to go through one. So as Cy mentioned, the rule was revised to have these alternatives. And what I'm going to talk about is sort of, well, what's going on? Are there any indicators of any impact of this rule and other things that the region is doing? I guess I should, a few caveats. The rule obviously was adopted in 91, amended in 98. That's not that long ago, particularly when you're talking about land use measures. And so some of the things I'm going to be talking about and showing may not directly be the result of things that are coming out of the transportation planning rule. It's really hard to dissect what is causing things, but at least we're trying to present some indicators of what's going on. One of the first things we did was look at transportation systems plans throughout the region to sort of see how the different cities and counties were responding to a major part of the rule requirement. And except for the city of Portland, none of them really attempt to meet the quantitative VMT and parking requirements. They support Metro's approach of doing an alternative in terms of supporting reduced reliance on automobile use. The City of Portland's transportation system plan is really unique for a lot of reasons. It is huge. We had someone in here two quarters ago, I think, talking about the plan. It's large. They did it in-house, which is also very unique because a lot of the systems plans we looked at were done by consultants. And what you tend to see with a lot of those plans is when they're all done by the same consultant, they start looking alike and not necessarily a lot of individual differences. In terms of commitment to the whole idea behind the rule, the plans again vary, and probably at one end is the City of Portland, very committed to supporting alternative modes, to meeting these targets. They have things in there that talk about congestion pricing and supporting that idea, and there's a lot of detail and a lot of commitment to these ideas. On the other hand, you have other cities and counties where the language is there, but the level of specificity and commitment isn't nearly as clear. Most of the plans do have lists of pedestrian and bicycle projects showing a lot of increase in that activity, and that's something fairly specific that we found in all of the plans. What I want to focus on a little more is trying to get at some of these performance measures, because everyone is asking, so Portland's doing all this stuff, what's happening? Does it really work? And that's a sort of a burning question out there that I will tell you I don't necessarily have, I certainly do not have a definitive answer of whether it's working, but maybe some indicators on what's happening. So what we did, and I'm going to give some credit to Teresa Carr, who was my graduate assistant last year, helping me on getting all this data, is we wanted to compare the Portland-Vancouver region. The reason it's Portland-Vancouver is because at the federal level they collect a lot of the data at the MSA level, Metropolitan Statistical Area, and so Vancouver is included in the region. When we could, we separated out the Oregon side of that data from the Vancouver, Washington side. We took regions that were larger than Portland, Vancouver, and smaller than Portland, Vancouver, and smaller and larger and smaller than just the Oregon side of that region. And then we added in Seattle, which was beyond sort of our limit of size, but since it's on the West Coast, we're often compared to Seattle, we threw them in. And so basically collected a lot of data of indicators to see how we compared to these other regions of comparable size. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to talk about bicycling, walking, transit, VMT per capita, and congestion as sort of 5 indicators of what's going on. First, giving you a little very short information about what projects, what is being done on the ground, and then some quantitative indicators. So Portland, the city of Portland, is frequently recognized as a top bicycling city in the U.S. and North America. City of Portland adopted their bike master plan in 1996 and widely regarded as a model for a city bicycle master plan. One indicator of what the city at least is committing is in 1996 when they adopted that plan, they had 111 miles of bikeways. That includes bike lanes, bike boulevards, and bike paths. That more than doubled by 2001, so there's definitely, in terms of seeing something on the ground, increased commitment to bicycling. There's an increase in counts of cyclists going across the bridges, so there's some indication that more people are bicycling. There's also a very active bicycle community, largely Bicycle Transportation Alliance. This provides support and the advocacy, similar to Thousand Friends, of making sure that bicycles are on the agenda and that these projects are carried through. So what do we see? I'm going to be using here a lot of data from the 2000 census. And it's not ideal for transportation data, but when you're trying to compare one region to another, there really are very few sources of comparable data that you can compare across the country. And one of those that you can use is the census. And on the census long form, they ask, how did you normally get to work the previous week? So we are talking about the end of March, basically, because the census is done on April 1st. And so what this is showing is the percent of people who say, I regularly commute, I usually commuted by bicycle last week, for these 19 regions that we're comparing Portland to. And you can see I have Portland, meaning the Oregon side of the region, in blue, and Portland, Vancouver, meaning the whole region, here in red. And these have been ranked in terms of percent bicycling. So in this case, San Jose, for these regions, was the #1 bicycling region. When we look at city-level data, Minneapolis often shows up as the #1 city. They're not on our list here because they're not a comparably sized region. So some indication that there's a fair amount, relatively fair amount of bicycling going on. Though the absolute numbers you are seeing, it's less than 1% of the people were regularly commuting by bicycle. The numbers within the city of Portland are going to be higher than that. In the outlying communities, generally lower than that. So walking. The city of Portland adopted a pedestrian master plan in 1998. When they started on this plan, they were one of the first cities in the country to try to develop such a plan. Part of that plan, they designated pedestrian districts throughout the city where it was thought that within that travel within that district should primarily be walking. Again, similar to bicycling, there's an active community and organizations led by the Willamette Pedestrian Coalition. Again, one of the first such organizations in the country that was really from a citizen base trying to advocate for pedestrians. So in terms of walking numbers, again, Portland, relative to these other regions, has a higher rate of walking. Here we see Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a slightly higher rate than Portland, led closely by Seattle. And you can look at some of the other. These are the same group of regions. They're just reshuffled based on the percent of people commuting by walking. Now, the other thing I'm going to point out here is commuting is how you get to work or school, and that's only one trip type. And the majority of our travel is not going to and from work every day. It's going shopping and restaurants and everything else. Unfortunately, there are really no sources of data where you can truly compare regions for those other trip purposes. Cities and regions do travel surveys, but we all do them a little bit differently, so it's very difficult to compare region to region for those other trip purposes. So particularly for something like walking and biking, going to work is not necessarily the primary trip purpose for people who walk and bike. It may be for other purposes. So in some cases, this may be understating the amount of walking and bicycling that goes on. Yeah. Do you have? Use your microphone, please.
Oh, okay. Where it says touch.
Yeah, and keep it. Got to keep it down.
Okay. I just wanted to know if you had any information on trending. Did you compare this to 1990 census?
I do. I don't have it here with me.
Okay.
Yeah. And I do have it for transit. I'll show you in a moment. But that is, and for some other things, I have trends. So speaking of transit, so what has the region done? I think a lot of us know this story. And a lot of this predates the rule, but it certainly sets up the infrastructure to support what the rule is trying to do. So in the 1970s, just very briefly, you have the Fairless Square and the Transit Mall downtown, so a commitment to transit. That sets up or help support definitely revitalization of downtown, and then also the light rail system that started in the 1980s, continues to expand in the 1990s and the current decade and into the future, not sure how much and when. Also, currently improving bus service, and we had the streetcar introduced in this decade. As another example of sort of a policy and a program that's supporting the ideas behind the Transportation Planning Rule and the 2040 growth concept is Metro's Transit-Oriented Development Program, which is taking money, usually federal money, and helping to downwrite the cost of private development near transit, both bus and primarily light rail. So trying to actually get these land use ideas implemented. And that was also something very innovative. This region was the first region to do something like this. And what they did led to the federal government sort of changing their rules and allowing other areas to do something similar. In terms of commuting by transit, again, you see Portland and the Portland-Vancouver region fairly high compared to these other regions. The highest in terms of commuting by transit, not surprising, Newark, New Jersey, part of the New York metropolitan area, has over 10% commuting by transit. Seattle is also high, but then next is Portland and Vancouver. And in terms of trend over time, from 1990 to 2000, transit share of commute trips nationwide fell from 5.3% to 4.7%, so a slight decline. For Oregon's share, the Oregon side of the region, commuting by transit actually went up during that decade from about 6% to about 7%. And the entire region, including the Washington side, went up as well. So transit was one case where we were sort of going against a nationwide trend of decreased transit for commuting. Now, on the transit side, there's actually some other sources of data out there because, again, the Census is only giving us commuting to work information. The federal government, the Federal Transit Administration, collects transit information from all of the transit agencies about a variety of things, including the number of trips made on the system, the extent of the system, operating characteristics of the system, etc. And so we dug through that data, and these are the same regions with the exception is we had to take Newark out because it was impossible to separate out the transit system of Newark region compared to New York City and the rest of the New York metropolitan area. So these are the cities where we were able to just look at the transit service for these regions. And this is transit trips per capita for the service area. And in this case, correct me if I get this wrong, Teresa, this is just TriMet. Okay. So this is, again, primarily the Oregon side in terms of transit. So transit trips per capita, again, you see Portland towards the top of these regions, only to be exceeded by Milwaukee, an older, more traditional Midwestern city. A couple other indicators that are commonly used in transit evaluation is vehicle revenue mile. And these are miles that the bus or the light rail train is driving, going, where they can actually collect passengers. So this is an indicator of the amount of service that's being provided. So it doesn't take into driving the bus back to the bus barn at the end of the evening and things like that. This is service that's on the road that people could board and make their trips. And so transit trips per vehicle revenue mile. Again, Portland is definitely towards the top of the pack here, exceeded by Milwaukee and Las Vegas, which may surprise you. Las Vegas in the past decade, for some reason, saw a big boom in relative boom for them in terms of transit use in that city. Whoops. This next one is actually misnamed. It should be vehicle revenue hour, and I think that is correct on the left-hand side. So this is another indicator of how much service by time. And again, Portland ranks up there in the top, exceeded again by Las Vegas, but now also Sacramento and Milwaukee. But again, fairly high indicator of the amount of trips taken per revenue hour of service. Another thing that we decided to look at was just looking at the light rail, because in the past 20 years there's been a whole lot of new light rail systems being built in the U.S., starting with the San Diego system. And these systems have come under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of questioning on whether or not they are worth the money that they're costing to build. And these systems are a lot different than the older cities, older rail cities that you find like New York and Boston, et cetera. So looking just at the cities that have these new light rail systems, this is light rail trips per capita for these cities. And here's a case where, again, you see Portland, in this case, exceeding just about everyone. San Diego following behind, amongst these, one of the older systems. Portland's is probably older than a lot of these systems as well. A different story, though, once you start looking at some of these other indicators of transit. Okay.
I always hear the argument about the naysayers say light rail is substantially increase in Portland, but that's at the expense of bus users. I mean, basically the transfer from bus users to light rail. How do you respond to that?
I could give a that certainly happens in a lot of these systems. I should probably, personally, I don't have a complete answer to that. I haven't looked at that for each of these systems. I know from anecdotal evidence that I've seen in the past, systems like Sacramento, that certainly happened a lot. I haven't dug into the Portland numbers that closely to tell you the extent of that, but that is an issue in terms of people switching, how much of this is new ridership versus others, but I don't have a comprehensive answer for you. It also wasn't really the exact focus of this work. In terms of looking again at some of those other transit indicators, light rail trips per vehicle revenue mile. So here we're starting to take into account how much service is actually out there. Here's a case where Portland is sort of really in the middle of the pack compared to these other light rail cities. For some reason, Pittsburgh is way up there, and Buffalo is way down there. But everyone else is sort of in the middle. Per revenue or per vehicle revenue hour, again, another indicator based on how much service is out there. Portland, again, in this case, is sort of in the middle of the pack in terms of trips per vehicle revenue hour. Now looking at VMT per capita. This information comes from the Highway Performance Monitoring System, HPMS, which is something that the Federal Highway Administration collects. And they collect this for all 50 states. The states report to them following similar procedures. And that data is collected at the national level and it's available. HPMS, and they have a way, they do these, HPMS collects information on both the system, miles of road out there, et cetera, and actual travel on the roads. And that includes doing traffic counts on the roads, and then they use the traffic counts to estimate vehicle miles traveled. And it's not a perfect ideal measure of VMT, but it is it's certainly the only one out there that you can use to compare across different cities, regions, and states, et cetera. So given that, we took the HPMS data for VMT, and because 19 different lines, and here I'm able to show a trend over time. I didn't want to show 19 separate lines, so what you see here is the Portland-Vancouver region over time and an average of the 19 other regions over time. And you can see some differences here. And so on average, the other 19 regions have been increasing from 1993 through 2001. Portland, Vancouver sort of peaked in 1996 and has been going down since through 2001. There were a couple other regions, I don't have the names in front of me, that also declined over these later years. But the majority of the regions were all increasing over this time period. In terms of, there's lots of things that impact daily vehicle travel aside from light rail systems and bike lanes and et cetera. And obviously one big thing that impacts VMT is the economy. And when people are unemployed, they drive less. All sorts of things impact travel aside from policies and programs related to transportation. The one thing, though, is from 96 to 2001, I did look at unemployment rate, and unemployment rate was certainly not going up during that time period. If it had been going up, that might be a reason VMT per capita was going down. So that isn't necessarily an explanation for the downward trend for the past 5 years. But another place where we rank high that a lot of people aren't happy with is congestion. This is the final sort of indicator that I am looking at. And the Texas Transportation Institute, TTI, every year comes since 86, or actually I can't remember. 82. Comes up with indicators of congestion for all regions throughout the country, and they have a ranking, and it's usually a big splash in the news. It happened a couple months ago. They came out with their new rankings, and actually Portland was looking worse than they are here in terms of congestion. This is one indicator that they use, the travel time index, which is sort of a ratio of the amount of time spent traveling versus what it would take in free flow conditions. And taking those same 19 regions, you see Portland, Vancouver ranks fairly high in terms of congestion. And this is for 2000. The newer numbers, I think Portland might actually be a little higher. So congestion levels, we're also right up there, but that's not necessarily where people want us to be. In terms of change in congestion from 82 to 2000, the years TTI has been doing this, amongst these regions, Portland actually ranked number 1 in terms of the percent increase in congestion over that 18-year period. And this is something a lot of people point to as a problem for this region in terms of increasing congestion. Others will point out that during this time period, Portland experienced an economic boom, a growth boom for this region, and that explains a lot of the increase because jobs boomed, the region boomed, our economy boomed, people moved in, etc. And compared to a place like Pittsburgh, you see at the bottom here, a lot of people will argue that, well, we don't necessarily want Pittsburgh's economy, and that explains some of this increase in congestion as well. The other thing I'll point out is that there's a lot of debate over whether TTI's indicators of congestion are really the best ways we should be measuring congestion. And for example, when the latest Portland numbers came out, some of the counter-arguments were, well, in Portland our commute times and commute distances are actually shorter, and that isn't necessarily taken into account here. And there's other critiques to this system as well. But I'm just presenting some data that's available at a national level to do some comparisons. So what do I conclude in terms of some of these numbers and indicators? I would say that some of the performance measures for alternative modes show that the programs and policies may be working. I mean, clearly, by these indicators, we have a higher percentage of people that are commuting on foot, on bicycle, or transit than most other comparable regions. Whether or not you can say that's because of the transportation planning rule or Oregon's planning system or who knows what, that's a little more difficult to decide. Secondly, a lot of the strategies that Cy has talked about that come out of the transportation planning rule are long-term strategies. Changing land use, changing the orientation of buildings, et cetera, is long-term. And it's a little early to tell sort of across the board to give a final report card on how this program has been doing. And it does raise a lot of questions about the future. And in particular, Can we keep that downward trend, for example, in VMT per capita? Is that going to continue? Is transit ridership going to continue to increase at an increasing rate compared to population? Those are very good questions, because a lot of people, they look at what we've done and it's like, well, in some cases we've done some of the easy things. You know, we got light rail in place where we could get it in place. It's going to be a lot more difficult to, for example, expand it across to Vancouver. You know, we've put in bike lanes where it was easy to put in bike lanes, and we've got all those sort of the low-hanging fruit. It's going to be a little more difficult to keep expanding the system in the same way. So a lot of questions about the future and in terms of whether these trends will continue, but it's certainly going to be interesting to watch. And so with that, we'll open it up to questions for both Cy and I. John, and yeah, use the microphone, you know.
Yeah. My question has to do with the measurement issue. I was involved in the rulemaking in the 5-year review, and I and a lot of others were always telling planners you can't actually measure this very accurately, if at all, at the local level, and you indicated almost no one is really trying to be benchmarks. So in the course of your interviews, did you come across anybody who was willing to admit that this program, you can't measure it, what's the point of having it? Or do they continue to cling to the notion that we should just keep looking at windmills?
Do you want to, I mean, in terms of the interview, do you want to?
I think people were willing to admit that this always was and continues to be an extremely hard thing to measure. And I think that's in large part why LCDC was willing to go along with an alternative approach. I think the arguments were made by people on the ground, by planners, both in public and private sectors, that this is a really tough one to get a handle on. And I think also it went along with the more philosophical argument, is it the right thing? Whether or not we can measure it accurately, is it the right thing to measure? And a number of people were making those arguments during the review and even before. And I think LCDC heard those arguments. This is, again, another reason why it decided to offer up an alternative path.
Well,
my question is related to the difficulty of the land use element being a long-term kind of outcome. We, in our history classes, we learned a lot about the influence of urban sprawl over the last several decades to create sort of the travel patterns we have today. Are planners and maybe the government being a little too impatient on the land use transportation connection? Because if maybe the vehicle miles traveled goal can be met, but just not until farther out. Are they not appreciating that it took since World War II for us to develop this urban sprawl system, that it might take another 40 years for us to develop a mixed modal system?
I would, I think people generally say that the land use measures take a long time. I think most people agree with that and don't argue with that too much, though I think in a policy arena, people want results and like to know, is it working, particularly if you start questioning, these requirements in the rule itself. There's always a desire to have some numbers, to say whether or not it's working, and that poses a real difficulty. And I think that's where we start doing, maybe not looking at overall VMT per capita, but there's a real push to try to get other indicators of whether or not this is working. Is the mode split at Aranco Station, for example, different than in other developments without that orientation? And that's sort of an interim way to sort of judge whether or not something is working. But my experience in policy is that there's always a push to have some numbers to show whether or not it's working to help sustain and keep those policies.
I think there's been for a long time an argument that land use is a second best alternative. That if you ask people in the field, they'll tell you, everybody will tell you, the only tool that will be able to bring about a dramatic change fairly quickly is a pricing approach. But in the same breath, everybody will tell you politically that's not feasible. And so what we end up doing is adopting policy instruments that promise some degree of motion in the right direction, but aren't able to influence behavior in the same shorter-term dramatic way as the approach that's not politically feasible.
And I think that's why, I mean, for example, when I show the numbers or telling the story of, well, we have more people biking and more people walking and more people taking transit, but our congestion levels are a lot higher. And, when people talk about trying to solve the congestion problem, it's pricing that would solve that problem. And that's really the only real solution that long term is going to keep congestion at a level that people would like.
Yeah. There's a little quote that was part of the review from a couple of the metro planners. It is psychic pain to deal with something that is impossible, not politically feasible. That's how it felt to a lot of people involved. That, again, they believe this is the right thing to do, the right direction to go, but it's going to be hard to get there with the tools that are politically available. Also, as part of the pricing issue, it raises the place question, that it appears to threaten much more directly what happens in and around downtown than elsewhere. So again, that's a part of the difficulty of building a consensus to take action on that particular approach. And again, that's long-standing. There's nothing new about that. It's been an issue debated widely in the field for more than 50 years.
Additional questions? Back, sorry, this person behind you can raise their hand first, but you'll be next. Yes.
Yeah. I think probably one of the greatest successes of the transportation planning rule is really that it killed a freeway for a rural part of the region. And the same framework is there in the policy, so that as the region is considering other freeways and investments, be held at the same standard. And in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled, it's probably the one thing that we can do, more than anything, is to prevent sort of new cities from popping up and relying on the Portland area for their employment base, or commuting from region to region. Portland to Salem, or Salem to Portland commute is huge. And so that was just one thought that I had. The other thought is that the transportation planning rule has procedural requirements in it that are doing a lot more that's maybe invisible to protect the investment that we have in the transportation system. Every time there's a development that's proposed in a city, the developer is required to prepare a traffic study, and if the development would exceed the capacity on the roadway, the arterial system, and or the local system, and change the functional classification of that road, then it's scrutinized, and there's an opportunity to stop it. So I think there's some things in the rule that are not really in the VMT provisions, but they're protecting the system, and they're really shaping the growth, which will eventually reduce VMT.
Although it's interesting to note that the highway proposal that gave rise to rulemaking didn't die easily and has had many lives. It hasn't gone away completely. And you're right, of course, that a key aspect of getting rulemaking going was the interest of the Oregon Department of Transportation to minimize traffic on its already overburdened facilities, given that the department felt financially constrained. So one important reason why the Department of Transportation supported the transportation planning rule was because it saw it as a way of maintaining the integrity of the investment in its facilities. Although even that now has become controversial, because land use planners will say that the highway folks themselves come under pressure to approve access to their facilities. And it's often been hard for them to resist making available, or saying there is available, capacity on the roads to accommodate proposed development. But that's the kind of thing that it's been about. And I think it's right to say that a major contribution of the rule has been to bring front and center these issues of integration, so that everybody on the transport side and on the land use side is thinking about the integration of transport and land use. And it continues to be controversial to put requirements in place and to implement them, but nevertheless, in a manner that's different than elsewhere in the United States, the issue is always in the front of people's minds about the development process.
Ken?
My question has to do with planning by mandates, particularly land use mandates. In that, I've been doing some comparative research up in Seattle, and they have a mandated density requirement. And what that is resulting in is, particularly in this application with infill subdivisions, is small subdivisions with cul-de-sacs and private drives off cul-de-sacs to meet the mandated density. That, and without a connectivity requirement, is kind of creating a new kind of problem rather than reducing automobile reliance. And so I guess the question is, if you're a mandate, have planning mandates, they can't be blunt instruments in a way.
I think that's one of the most ancient and profound issues, is the use of the mandate by a higher level authority to manage what goes on at the local level, and how it often becomes a case of it's unreasonable. In any particular circumstance, implementing a higher level mandate can produce all kinds of unacceptable and unreasonable outcomes. And it seems to me it's a built-in struggle. It comes from, I think, the same sorts of things that we saw in the evolution of the rule, that the advocates don't trust the local folks. I think that's the root cause of these sorts of things. Again, because of their analysis that left to their own devices, the locals will simply not do what it takes. They won't have the ability, the capacity to say no, to restrain, to manage in a way that will achieve these long-term objectives. And once you're in that sort of context, an awful lot of the time, what the mandate requires will be unreasonable in particular cases.
I mean, I think that that's one of the reasons we see an increasing trend towards more performance-based standards or regulations. So saying, well, we don't care how you do it as long as you meet this performance measure, travel or whatever it might be. But then you get into the problem that John mentioned already. Well, if we don't have a good way to measure that performance, that makes, and if we question how we measure that performance, that makes performance-based regulation more difficult, whereas it's easy to measure X units per acre. We can do that. And so it makes policy far more difficult. Question? Mike?
You mentioned before the implementation of this rule that there was some debate whether or not VMT was the appropriate thing to be measuring in this process. What else was considered, and why didn't they go with something else instead of VMT?
Alternatives that were considered included mode share. It included measures of congestion. I think those were the main ones that were talked about at the time. And the consensus seemed to be that vehicle miles traveled more accurately represented what we were trying to address. Because also that vehicle miles traveled was related to air quality issues. A number of people thought more directly than some of the other measures.
Jennifer, maybe you covered this, but did you know that LCDC is undergoing a mini evaluation of the TDR, and there's actually going to be a report in a couple of months on what the MPOs are doing around the state in reducing reliance on the automobile?
I'm glad to hear that. We've been wondering and hadn't followed up. We're going, wait a minute, the next 5-year review should have happened a couple years ago. And we just,
Full evaluation,
yeah.
just a report.
Okay, great. I'll have to follow up on that. Okay. So thank you very much for attending. And those of you who are enrolled in this as a USP class, those of you who I know, who I saw ask questions, I'll just write you down. But the rest of you need to write out a question. If you didn't ask one now, and it's just a record keeping. And then those of you who are enrolled, if you didn't sign in here, please do so now.